The vast majority of the cars which we discuss in this series do, understandably, tend to revolve around the performance world, in either road or racing forms. You occasionally get a speed record vehicle, mostly though they tend to be race cars or motorsport-inclined vehicles, which just didn't really hit the mark. Maybe they had a good idea, but as I've said before, didn't necessarily carry it out in the best way, or were purely a victim of circumstance. That is unfortunate when that happens. Now, this vehicle wasn't really that. It was more flawed by its own design, but not really in a way which made it fundamentally bad. It was more so just a little bit too advanced for its own good, and for production costs and expectations of how many they would actually sell, it didn't really seem to be a viable option. And that was probably the correct idea to have and the correct route to go down, not producing the car on a mass production scale. But this vehicle, the Gregoire, built in 1952, debuted at the Paris Motor Show, is a striking looking classic. I'm a huge fan, of course, of classic and vintage cars. This one is almost bordering between the two. It has some very old-fashioned design cues and some old-fashioned thinking, but in the best ways. I personally think that the colour was an excellent choice as well. Gorgeous looking car, I think. It's got this very smooth, flowing, bubble-esque design, but also very simple. And of course, the front end is a dead giveaway, because this car is utilising my personal favourite type of combustion engine. Yes, indeed, the gas turbine. Of course, it has a gas turbine. The front end looks basically like an aeroplane, so obviously it uses a gas turbine. Now, the gas turbine in question is not a particularly large one. And this actually brings me back to what I mentioned at the start of the video, because some of the cars which we discuss are not necessarily trying to be extremely fast. Now, this car for its time would have been pretty fast, but not the fastest thing around, and performance wasn't even its initial or first intent. If it was fast, then that would have been good, but that wasn't what they were going out to achieve. What they were trying to achieve is what many manufacturers who made gas turbine concepts were also trying to do, and that was not just make a fast car, but even just to make a viable one, to try and make aviation technology viable for the street, and also to ascertain whether or not it was something that various manufacturers, bigger or smaller, this one, a smaller occasion, wanted to do that, whether they wanted to put that time and effort and development money into pursuing that. And 9 times out of 10, of course, that wasn't viable enough. And unfortunately, due to the times that we live in now, the fact that gas turbines were not given the time and the money and the development over the decades that I would say they deserve to have, occasionally you would get a team or a manufacturer who tried it. Some even made it work, most notably Howmet in the car world and Marine Turbine Technologies in the motorbike world. They made it work, but most people, they don't. They come across the same problems that everyone else has, and they choose not to push forward. Understandably so, because for every advantage that a gas turbine gives you, and there are many, they do definitely give you disadvantages. My love for the engine does not blind me to that at all, just like those who love the rotary engine should not be blind to the disadvantages of that engine. All engines have downsides. It just so happens that with a gas turbine, they're pretty readily apparent. Now, as far as the technical side of this car goes, it was designed by a French engineer, by, surprise, surprise, the name of Gregoire, his last name that is, and the gas turbine in the car was built by, I'm not sure exactly how to pronounce it, but Socema, or Socema, it's an acronym anyway, but they built aviation parts and mechanicals, so they built the turbine itself. It's a 100 horsepower turbine, so very small, very basic, very compact, which is exactly what you'd want for a production scale. I personally love low-powered turbines. I think that's just inherently cool, but maybe that's just me. The idea of a family car with a gas turbine engine appeals to me. But even though it only has 100 horsepower, and no doubt a lot more torque than that, probably in the region of 200 pound-feet, if not more, it produces peak power at 25,000 RPM, red lines at 45,000 RPM, but it's not just in the raw spec that the car is, I would say, amazing for its time. Because, from a technical standpoint, This car was remarkable for 1952. Consider this, the transmission, or the gearbox, on this car had to be entirely different, and it does for any gas turbine-powered vehicle, be it car or bike, because the gas turbine engine is most commonly used for helicopters. And the purpose of that engine in a helicopter is not start-stop technology. A helicopter isn't designed to be turning off the engine and turning it on, or slowing down and speeding up constantly. It's designed to get up to speed and stay there. In the air, usually. So you'd hope. With a car, that's not the case. With a car, you do need to start and stop a lot. To slow down for lights, to overtake, to pull into the driveway, to take a corner. A helicopter doesn't have to do any of that stuff most of the time. So that inherently brings up some problems, and one of the main problems that the average driver wouldn't even think of when it comes to a gas turbine is that the engine doesn't slow itself down. There is no engine braking, or virtually no engine braking, on a gas turbine. Because, of course, with a normal car, when you have to, for instance, slow down for a stoplight, you put your foot on the brakes, you bring the car to a halt, and the engine, without you even thinking, slows itself down, engine braking. With a turbine, that doesn't happen. You can slow the car down, but the engine will still be running basically at the same speed. So you'll have brought it to 0 miles per hour, you're sitting there waiting for the green light, and the engine's already doing 45,000 RPM. So when you try to uptake drive, one of two things are basically going to happen. You're going to smash straight into the car in front of you because you've got 45,000 RPM straight to the wheels, or you'll just basically mince your mechanicals. You'll turn everything inside the car to mush. And obviously you don't want those two things to happen, so what you have to do is approach that problem in an entirely different way. And I love all of this stuff, as I'm sure you can tell, these problem solvers that tried to make turbines work. But what they did to make it work was very clever, because they actually had two separate electromagnetic systems. One for the transmission, which was a Kotal system, which is basically a form of transmission which isn't seen anymore, but back in the 30s and 40s especially, it was very popular. And basically it was a pre-select system, where you would choose the gear that you wanted the car to change into before you wanted to change. So it's kind of like a semi-automatic. You would choose the gear, you'd move the shifter, but then the car would actually change itself into that gear. So kind of an automatic, but not quite. Sort of a semi-automatic, about as close as you could get at the time. So this car had that, which in itself is pretty cool, but for the time, nothing really that outlandish. But then to slow the car down, or specifically to slow that engine down to a more viable speed to pull away and to slow down and to do everything that a normal car needs to do, they also fitted it with another electromagnetic system, but this was a Telma retardant braking system. And basically what that was, is it used electromagnetic power in the transmission itself to forcibly slow down the engine. An engine brake, literally. So that not just slowing the car down through the wheels and traditional brakes, but slowing the engine down as well, which I just think is such a clever solution. It's a simple one, relatively speaking, but as I've said before, I love complex problems that have simple solutions, or simple ideas applied to more complex issues. That really impresses me, and I love that on this car. And you've got to remember, this is 1952 we're talking about. The average car wasn't exactly this advanced in 1952. Now, the car itself only weighs 1.3 tons, and that's European tons, which is 1,300 kilos, which in America is 2,800 pounds. That's pretty good. That's very lightweight. That's like hatchback territory these days. And the car had, as I said, 100 horsepower. So, being a turbine, they're traditionally sluggish at lower speeds, but what kind of top-end potential could this car actually have, given that turbines, especially in aerodynamic vehicles, generally have pretty good top speeds? Well, this one does. The projected or claimed top-end speed was in the region of 200 kilometers per hour, which is about 125 miles per hour. Now, that doesn't sound incredible by today's standards, but it actually is. 125 miles per hour from a 100 horsepower car is actually really good, even by today's standards. And to put that into some perspective, 2 years later, Mercedes brought out their most iconic classic, the 300 SL Gullwing Coupe. That car had well over double the power of this concept car, but the top speed was what, 145-ish on that Gullwing? That's only 20 miles per hour faster than this, with more than double the power. That's pretty impressive, given that that car is widely loved and extremely valuable, and yet this one, nobody even talks about it. That's a shame, because first of all, look at it. Secondly, consider the tech, and imagine how good this thing sounds with that traditional, high-pitched, constant whistle from the turbine. Personally, I adore this car. It's one of my favourite classics. It's one which I don't talk about much, even myself, on the channel, because as much as I love talking about turbines, you can't just bring up every turbine-powered car ever every time I mention it. So I love the opportunity of talking about this car here. I first saw it years ago in a classic car magazine, and at least last time I checked, it was being housed in the Le Mans Museum at Sarthe, France. I'm not sure if it's still there now, but at least it was. So a pretty cool car, which had essentially the same issues as every other gas turbine-powered concept car and prototype, and that was that it was deemed too expensive to produce, too complex to manufacture, used too much fuel, and produced too much heat, which is the exact same issues that every gas turbine vehicle will always have. You just can't change that when you're using a traditional turbine, because that's just the way it is. Which, I would say, in summary, makes me, every time I look at one of these failed concepts, appreciate those two occasions in particular when manufacturers actually made it work. And they didn't just make it work, they made it work well. Howmet with the TX, the turbine-powered race car which actually won a race. And of course, more recently, with my favourite vehicle ever, the MTT Y2K motorcycle. It really makes you appreciate how well that company in particular did, because Howmet made a race car that won. That is awesome. But the Y2K is a production motorbike. You can just drive it down the street, or ride it down the street. That's no small task, but they did it. And you get a lifetime warranty on the engine. It sounds like I'm advertising for them now, but hey, I don't even care if I'm sponsored by them. I would happily advertise that bike all the chances I get. So overall, this car, the Socema, not sure, the Gregoire, is an awesome concept car, one which barely anyone talks about, most people haven't even heard of, but it's a great looking car with some awesome tech, and I appreciate the opportunity of just taking a moment to talk about this unsung hero. But that's it for this pick overall. Of course, if you'd like to check out others in this series, then you can click through and see those at the end of this video. But for now, as always, thanks for watching.